G'day, it's Brett Winterford here. I'm the Senior Director of Cybersecurity Strategy at Okta, and I'm coming to you today from Perth in Western Australia. I really wish I could be with you in person. I want to thank the FIDO Alliance and the organisers of the Authenticate conference for having me address you nonetheless. Today we're going to talk about some common MFA bypass techniques. As numerous studies have shown, MFA buys you a lot of protection for not a lot of cost. When it's applied to every point of access and it's configured thoughtfully, the research says that it solves for at least 90% of account takeover events. That's why Google is mandating MFA for all accounts by the end of the year and Salesforce by February. But as we all know, MFA isn't infallible. With these mandates coming into effect, I thought it was an opportune time to revisit some common MFA bypass techniques and talk about some of the ways that defenders need to account for them. First, let's look at misconfigurations. There are some scenarios in which an organisation has applied MFA for access to a network or to an application without accounting for alternative protocols that could be used to authenticate to those same resources. A top of mind example is for access to Microsoft's Office 365. Today there are methods for accessing Office 365 that support both modern and basic authentication. When you hear someone say modern authentication, that means any method compatible with MFA, and basic authentication are those that are limited to just username and password. Now, strangely enough, an organisation might have enabled modern authentication in their Exchange Online tenant, and that way they're able to protect users with MFA when they sign into Office 365 directly or via their IDP. But that's not the end of it. If those admins also fail to explicitly deny access to Office 365 using basic authentication, an attacker can still make requests using legacy access protocols, which then don't support MFA. Our research shows that an Office 365 tenant that allows basic authentication is far more frequently targeted by commodity account checking services. And Microsoft's own research shows that you're 22 times more likely to be compromised via these legacy protocols, again because of the absence of MFA. For that reason, Microsoft will deprecate basic authentication to Microsoft Exchange Online by October 2022. If you haven't already weeded it out of your Office 365 tenant, I suggest you get moving. I've recently posted a blog on the subject to provide some guidance on where Okta customers might want to begin. The second most common form of bypass is credential phishing, used in combination with reverse proxies. These are tools that are designed to intercept credentials while at the same time passing on a user's request to a legitimate site that the attacker is imitating. Because the user has successfully authenticated to a legitimate site during the attack, what the attacker gets is the authorization tokens required to replay that session post-auth. Defending against these kind of attacks requires layers of controls. You can, for example, monitor newly registered domains and newly issued certificates looking for brand abuse. You can also use the integrations between your identity provider and network security tools to help identify requests that have been routed through known suspicious infrastructure. You should also be teaching your staff how to identify the domain for your legitimate sign-in page and how to report to the security team when they're asked to visit a URL that doesn't look right. You should also think about creating access policies that challenge a user with step-up authentication when they try to access higher risk applications, just to create some extra detection opportunities. Another crafty MFA bypass is OAuth phishing, which Microsoft calls consent phishing. This is where attackers trick users into granting an app that's been created by the attacker with the permission to access data in the user's account. This is basically the result of overly permissive settings in cloud platforms, and also just how easy it is to trick users who are naturally inclined to trust dialog boxes that appear within the context of a cloud platform that they use every day. Attackers can really easily abuse that trust by registering an app that sounds legitimate, like an email filtering tool, for example. And it sounds perfectly reasonable that a tool like that would need to access data in your account. We shouldn't be expecting that users can distinguish between legitimate third-party apps and dodgy ones. It just shouldn't be the user's problem. Mercifully, Microsoft is gradually tightening its publisher verification process and introducing some halfway decent defaults for admins to work with. I recommend that admins deny the ability for users to consent to integrate new apps until those apps have first been verified by the admins, especially if the app requests some risky permissions like read-write access to your inbox. Those last two attacks and many of the others that we'll discuss later typically involved some element of social engineering. but I felt we should also create a standalone category for incidents where the attacker used only social engineering to bypass MFA. We often observe incidents where the attackers had stolen or somehow verified a username and password by some other means, and then they just brazenly pick up the phone or jump into a chat and convince the user to blindly accept an MFA prompt on their behalf. That's why user education is so important, as I said earlier, and so is your choice of factors. I'm sure I don't need to tell this audience twice about the benefits of phishing-aware MFA or phishing-resistant MFA, which is far more likely to throw some sand in the gears of social engineers. Number 5 in our list is more social engineering really, but combined with some good old-fashioned automation. This year we've seen the emergence of some bot services that attackers can configure to make automated voice calls to their targets. These bots purport to be an automated service provided by a bank or a payment service provider or some other trusted entity, and they have the intention of tricking a target into sharing a one-time password or some other details. Once again, these scams are no match for phishing-resistant forms of authentication, like Okta's passwordless technology, for example. Number 6 on my list are attacks that rely on infection of user devices. There's long been malware out there that can capture the one-time password sent over SMS to an infected mobile device. What's become more interesting is the proliferation of malware that grabs session cookies from the browser of an infected device after a user is authenticated. These attacks are best mitigated when your device management provider like VMware Workspace ONE or Jamf, or your device health provider like CrowdStrike or Microsoft or others, if they can send signals out of band to your identity provider in real time to be taken into account during authentication. So this is device context that can inform access policies dynamically. If a device is infected, basically the authentication fails. With Okta, you can set different access policies based on whether a device is known or associated with a user, whether the device is managed, whether the device is patched, and whether the device gets a clean bill of health from a trusted EDR partner. Number 7 on our list is abuse of credential enrolment and password reset flows. Now, this has been a challenge for web developers since the birth of the internet, basically. And the complexity of these flows is one of the big reasons why so many organizations authenticate their users via cloud services like Auth0 or Okta, who think about this stuff every day. Even still, a lot of admins don't think through what might happen if an attacker can compromise either the primary or the secondary email account of a user. And what that means if the organization is relying on things like email magic links or using email for password resets. My advice is to make sure you threat model and document your recovery flows in particular. Then you need to train your help desk on those flows and test whether they can be exploited by a wily attacker. Finally, one more form of social engineering, SIM swapping. It's as old as the hills. This is where fraudsters have somehow gained the personal details of a target, and then they use those details to trick staff at a mobile carrier into porting the victim's number to a device that the attacker controls, and then the attacker can use that access to intercept one-time passwords or perform password resets, etc. Intriguingly, we've seen a few news stories lately where staff at mobile carriers have been arrested after facilitating some of these scams for a fee. I first wrote a news story about this scam something like 15 years ago, so I'm pleased to see now regulators demanding that telcos authenticate any user that's attempting to port a mobile phone number. I feel like that's super important because while, yes, phishing-resistant MFA renders this problem largely irrelevant, there are still users out there for which SMS is the only MFA technology that's practical to their needs, and some form of MFA is always better than none. So aside from the misconfiguration issues we discussed right up front, social engineering was required in most of the methods for bypassing MFA that we've discussed. And the only exception tends to be when a device is already compromised, at which point MFA bypass is but one of your troubles. In any case, MFA always introduces friction for the attacker, and the attacker always has to work a little harder. In organizations where MFA is applied pervasively, any attack tends to be noisier and easier to detect. So here are my key takeaways. Configuration is key. Make sure you understand every alternative form of access. Also, don't rely on your cloud service provider to deliver secure defaults. Here's a recent example. Can members of the public send messages to your staff using Microsoft Teams? Take a look at your config because you might be surprised. Include your users in any solution. Provide them tools and training for how to report suspicious activity. Okta has capabilities, for example, for sending out automated user notifications when a new device is being used, or when there's a credential reset event or something else that could be a suspicious behavior. So a user can quickly turn around and say, hey, that wasn't me, something must be amiss. You should be documenting and testing your password and factor reset flows. Number 2, you should be aligning authentication to risk. We recommend using step-up authentication, using phishing-resistant factors whenever user, device, or network context changes. Finally, reduce the blast radius. By this I mean attackers will always try to use any access that they've gained to an account to try and social engineer from there to an admin account, because that's what they're really after. So you really need to be looking at privileged access management and thinking about how that applies in a cloud-first world. Thank you very much. That's it from me. You can find me on Twitter at Predator, or you can read my analyses at Risky Business, my former employer, or at the Okta security blog on sec.okta.com. Thanks very much for having me and enjoy the rest of the event.